Welcome to Fredericksburg Underground. I'm your host, Stan Miles. Today we're here at the Old Stone Warehouse, which was built in 1813 by Patriot Thomas Goodwin. It was also believed to be a 1754 tobacco warehouse. Now, today we're going to meet with Jack Edlund, who's the curator of this fine museum. And he's going to go over a couple of the artifacts that they found here in the area. And hopefully you learn a little bit more about maybe some of the trash that you can find that isn't really trash. And this is Jack Edlund. He's the curator of the Old Stone Warehouse here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now, today we're going to be talking about some of the things that you can actually find if you walk out of your back door and you live in any town that is circa Civil War, Revolutionary, because something that's commonly known is that there was a lot of trash pits around those types of towns. When something broke, they tossed it out the window. One man's trash was another man's treasure, as they say. Jack, thanks for having us.
Thanks, Stan. If you have a building 200 years old, one person a year loses one object. That's 200 objects. Then imagine if you've got 4 years of Civil War guys smashing stuff. And in the olden days, you didn't go to the dump. You just pitched stuff out in the backyard of the hollow, and occasionally we run across it. And leading into that, this is a collection of bottles that came from some leveling in the backyard of a restaurant on Caroline Street in downtown Fredericksburg, Virginia. And so what we're going to do is talk about criteria. Now, this is one collection. I brought these two out simply because I want to talk about pommel scars. Every piece of glass they made before 1860, they blew it into a wooden mold and they held it on a long glass rod called a pommel rod. And then you held the pommel rod while you polished the top. When you were done, you snapped off the pommel rod, and as a result, you get what's called a pommel scar. Anytime you see this on the bottom of a bottle, it's 1860 or earlier. So if you're ever at a yard sale or a junk shop and you see a bottle with that scar and you could buy it for 50 cents or $1, I would. If you're ever in the woods and they used to throw their trash in the hollow, if you see a pommel scar like this, I would stop and look because it's a pre-1860 site. So this is called a pommel scar, pre-1860. Now these all came from this restaurant, and if you look at the bottom of every one of them, none of them is pommel scarred. We have no pommel scars. So automatically, that tells me that these bottles were made after 1860. Now, to go even a little further, what we're going to do now is talk about seams. In 1860, they invented a clamp which held the bottom of the bottle and you lost your pommel scar. The reason you had to hold the bottle was you still polished the top. And when you polish the top, the seam disappears. This one, seam runs right up and disappears. He's pre-1900. Let's see if we can find. Sometimes it's hard to see because they're oxidized. Seam goes up here, he disappears. He's 1900. Let me see if I can find a good one where it disappears and then we can do a close-up. Now, as I was pointing out, the seam runs up here. Notice it disappears. That tells me it's before 1900 because after 1900 they invented the automatic bottle making machine and the seam goes over the top. So because it's not pommel scarred, I know it's after 1860. The seam disappears, so I know it's before 1900. Halfway between 1860 and 1900, I'd say this bottle is about 1880. Now, in the course of cleaning these bottles, none of the seams go over the top. There's only one exception. It's a Coke bottle, and you'll notice if you look real close, the seam goes over the top. This was after they had the automatic bottle making machine. I think it's really 1902, but I just say 1900 for the sake of it. So this bottle was made after 1900, but the seams disappear on every other one of these, so they were made before 1900, and yet none of them are pommel scarred. So again, leads us back to the conclusion 1870, 1880. Now what's interesting about this Coke bottle, it's dated November 16, 1915. This is the very first year they made the Mae West style Coke bottle. So again, this seam goes all the way over the top, indicative of after 1900. Before 1900, you would still have to polish it. You can use this on any bottle. If that seam goes over the top, it's after 1900. If it disappears, it's before. So that leads me to, again, to believe this stuff is all 1870, 1880. They didn't have ballpoint pens. They didn't have fountain pens. You dip your pen in ink. These are all ink wells. This is a bulk ink. This is kind of an interesting one. You find them like this in the Civil War camps, although this one is a little later, but if I was dishonest, I could probably push it off the Civil War. It was probably 1870, 1880. It's called a turtle ink. Here's another one. This one actually had the spot for your pens. They drank a little bit, you'll notice. Here's a little whiskey flask. Here's a top to a canning jar, patented December 1858, 68, and so on. And then little medicine bottles. One of my favorites, M.M. Lewis, druggist, Fredericksburg, Virginia. He had a shop on William Street in the late 19th, early 20th century. Bottle tops, kind of, you notice this one is a blob top. This is pre-1893. After 1893, you get the crown top. So this is kind of toward the tail end. And then we have the baking soda bottles, early toothpaste tubes. But this is just typical of one area, but just looking at the bottles, we can tell it's probably 1860, 1870. So there it is. The fuzziness, they're oxidized. The glass is actually starting to disintegrate. It's been in the ground so long, it's actually going bad. And that's another good indication of how old the bottle is. The ones from the early 18th century, early 1700s, actually the oxidization actually flakes off. Some people like it. You can spray end dust or baby oil on it. It'll make it look like new, and you can rinse it off. Now, as I mentioned while we were into the bottles from Caroline Street, we were going to talk ceramics. When we were done, we were going to talk ceramics. So here it is, and you find this stuff everywhere. There's guys in Fredericksburg that eyeball. They actually wait till it rains and go out where the sidewalks are torn up and stuff. And I actually do and collect ceramics. Just we find them in our backyard. I find them under the bridge next door. And they're pretty well diagnostic stuff is dated. And we'll start off with, you probably won't see much around here, but John Smith mapped the Indian villages. But late woodland Indian pottery, Marlboro Point, and there was a lot of it on the beach, dug a lot of it. There's an intact bowl over there we have. But what basically I want to talk about is English ceramics. And again, the English had the colonies to sell them stuff. The only exception you would see would be the German Rhenish ware, because you had a German king of England. They made this stuff in the Rhineland, sent it over to England. I don't think the English liked it and sent it to America. But anyway, most of the stuff originates in England. Now there's three types of ceramics. You have porcelain, you have your stoneware, and then you have your earthenware. Porcelain, the Chinese found out that if you took the white kaolin pipe, like the clay they make the white pipes out of, well, if you put feldspar in with that and fired it really hard, you would get this really nice porcelain. And porcelain, you can always tell, it has a white base. Nobody else is white. Anytime you find porcelain, you'll see it's white. This is very expensive. It had to be imported from China. And nobody else knew how to make porcelain, and the reason porcelain is always blue is because you had to fire it so hot and so long that all the colors burn off except blue. If you see porcelain with another color on it, it's been fired up afterwards. Now, so this is porcelain, and this was imported. Now, the Europeans didn't have porcelain, so they tried to copy it, and what they had is clay, or what we call earthenware. You took clay, and then you get into the different glazes, which this people had a lot of trouble with. These are all made out of clay. These are all called earthenwares. Now, the Dutch in the city of Holland found out that if you put a tin glaze on top of an earthenware, it would actually look like Chinese porcelain. Unfortunately, the glaze flaked away, so this is called tin glazed earthenware. This probably could go back to the mid-1600s, but most of this stuff we see around here is like 1650, 1750, 1780 and stuff. Because by then, by the mid, say 1740s, 1780s, Europeans found out how to make porcelain, and you got your myosin and all that kind of stuff. But these are called earthenwares. Mocha, this is interesting. The glaze is made out of tobacco spit and urine. You'll find shell edge pearlware everywhere in the city. We have some bowls over there on display, as a matter of fact. They probably used this from 1790 to 1760 to 1890. They quit making the green in 1820. And this is another type of earthenware. This is Wealden. A guy named Wedgwood studied under Wealden, and Wealden just put glazes on the piece and fired it, so it's random. It's very abstract. These are lead glazes. You have a salt glaze, and these are kind of interesting. Dot diaper basket weave pattern. This is 1740, 1760. Here's a little piece we found under the bridge. And as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about Rhenishware. You had a German king of England, and he shipped stuff over. Well, that's called stoneware. It has a gray body. So we've just talked about all three kinds. Here's your porcelain, here's your earthenware, now we go to stoneware. Stoneware, probably 90% of the time, has a salt glaze. If you look at it, it actually has like an orange peel look about it. You can see it a little better on this piece, like an orange peel look. And they just took this green stone clay and then they threw it in the kiln and threw salt on it, and that's what you get. Now, it's called, a lot of times it's called early American salt glaze. Here's a piece I found under the bridge. And what's interesting, the old pieces, wherever there's a handle, they always painted blue around it. So this is called early American salt glaze. This is the same piece, maybe 100 years earlier. This is called Rhenishware. This was made in the Rhineland in Germany, shipped to England. The English shipped it to America. You can always tell the Rhenishware because between the blue and the gray, they scratched a line. See the blue and the gray. This even has manganese purple in it right here. So this is our salt glaze stoneware. So there we've covered ceramics. Now you're a ceramics expert.
Welcome back to Fredericksburg Underground. I'm your host, Stan Miles. And again, we're here today at the Old Stone Warehouse in Fredericksburg, Virginia with Curator Jack Edlund. Now, we've talked some about bottles, we've talked some about ceramics, and now we've got some utensils that actually come back from the Civil War time period. We got some bayonets that were used for other things, and Jack's going to explain some of that.
Now, we were talking domestic debris earlier, ceramics and stuff just left around. People have been here for so long, they've left a lot of stuff. And what's interesting is we had the American Civil War, the river exactly halfway between the two capitals. So we have 4 battles: Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, each the size of Gettysburg within, say, a 20-mile radius. When they weren't fighting in the summertime, they went into winter camps. Well, the Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers looted the local houses, and when they built their tents, they would build their log cabin, put their tent on top, and dig the floor out for additional headroom. Well, now the relic hunters are going and finding stuff, and because we find the stuff looted from the houses, it gives us a good idea of what kind of silverware they were using, what kind of spoons they were using, and things like that. And this is some dug stuff from the immediate area, most of it from the Union camps across the river. Forks, these were looted, the 2-pronged forks and the 3-pronged forks, probably looted from local houses. The general rule is 2 prongs 1700s, 3 prongs 1800s, and 4 prongs 1900s. So these are a couple of 18th century forks, so that if you want to know what kind of forks they were using in Fredericksburg in the 1700s, here we have it. Spoons. We dig the spoons out and the handles are cut off. And you think, why on earth would they cut the handles off the spoons? Even the folding knife, forks, and spoons, they would rip them out of the rest of the thing. And you go, why would they do that? And then somebody said, well, you could carry it in your pocket. As long as you have enough to hang on to, why carry all the rest of it? And hence, we find the cut-off spoons. This one was dug out of the floor of the old Temperance Tavern in Falmouth. It's actually been filed around, and there was an 11th Corps badge, a half moon, dug right on top of it, buried in the dirt floor. Bayonets. Local guys call these dead hooks. Dead guys, and they tied a rope and drug them into the burial pit. I don't think that's true. These are pot hooks. You hung your pot off of it. This one is an English Enfield blade. Whenever you see the groove stops, that's an Enfield. If it goes straight on through, that's a Springfield bayonet. That's how you can tell. Here's an English Enfield bayonet from a Confederate camp in Orange County. Here's one they were bending, didn't quite make it, and it broke off. And again, the Springfield bayonet pot hook. On the subject of cooking, there's a really neat sketch. I wish someplace it's in a book. It's by a guy named Edwin Forbes, and it's called Christmas Dinner. And there's a Civil War soldier sitting in a brush lean-to. He's got a little campfire in front of him, and he's holding his ramrod in front of him, and he's got a cracker and a little piece of meat on it. And basically, these are Civil War hot dog sticks. This one was made out of a Civil War ramrod. Here's another one. This one was actually hammered flat by the blacksmith. I guess you hang your canned soup or whatever off of it. And then John Billingsley wrote that in the camps. He said a lot of times the soldiers would use their own ingenuity, and they would take a canteen, throw it in the fire, melt the solder off, and then you could use the canteen half for a dinner plate or a shovel, depending on your situation. And in the early Civil War camps, you find a lot of these canteen halves where the relic hunters would dig them out, throw them along the side of the tent hole, and then you would find them. There's some in the case, and here's part of one right now. They had a lot of cans. The cans usually had a two-piece solder together, and they didn't have can openers. Most of the Civil War cans you see will actually be opened like a can opener, little triangular holes all the way around the edge. And sardine cans, here, I'll pull one out. Some of them with Paris labels, but these are all dug from the Civil War camps as debris. I think Bruce Catton says 130,000 Yankees camped across the river for the better part of 4 years, and 70 to 90,000 Confederates on this side. And I'm not talking about right here. I've got a copy of a letter from a Confederate in 1863, and he said, we're pretty well fortified from the Blue Ridge to Port Royal. So these are all debris from the two Union armies facing each other along the Rapidan and the Rappahannock River. We talked about forks and we talked about spoons. We could talk about knives, just typical butter knives dug from the Civil War camps. These are two interesting ones, both dug from Civil War camps, but notice how the end of the knife flares up. That's 18th century. These are probably 1750s, 1780s, something like that. But again, looted from houses as opposed to your regular old butter knife, which looks like that. Little side knives you find around. Here's one that was lost in the scabbard. That wooden handle long since rotted off. Here's another tiny little one. Again, dug from the Civil War camps, but just domestic stuff. These guys were probably using these in the tent holes to, chop their meat or whatever. And it's subject of knives. Then you get into pocket knives. That's a very common find in the Civil War camps. Here's 3 of them. So if you want to know what kind of pocket knife somebody was using in the 1860s, here they are. If you want to know what kind of pocket knives people are using in the 1700s, again, because the Civil War soldiers brought their own stuff in from home and from everywhere in the country. We have stuff from California and Florida and Texas here, but you'll notice these 2 knives. See if we can get them up here. Notice how the handle curves. Same with this one. Notice how the handle curves up. These are both 18th century. These both date from the middle of the 1700s. But again, dug from the Civil War camps. And then along as we're talking knives, we might as well talk straight razors, edge stuff. This is an interesting piece, and the only reason I have this is because it has a bullet. It has an improvised handle. Somebody took, looks like a 3-ring Yankee mini bullet, carved and slotted it, and actually made a handle for his straight razor. But this is all typical debris. You get into any place in the city or even any high hill in Stafford County across the river that was a Civil War camp, there's stuff. And if you know about it, it gives you a little bit more insight or a little bit more advantage on everybody else, because you kind of know what you're looking at, and it gives you a dating criteria for that. And plus it gives you a familiarity of where you came from. And if you know where you come from, you know who you are. And if you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're going. And if you don't know where you're going, you end up someplace else.
So I wanted to thank you, Jack, for having us here today and being a part of Fredericksburg Underground and telling us a lot about some of the common things that you can find just right outside your back door. Now, we also don't suggest going into Civil War battlefield camps and just start digging. Make sure you get permission from the proper authorities, because you don't want a trespassing charge.
And plus, just maybe to interrupt a little bit, I have children that bring stuff. They find a piece of ceramic in their basement and they bring it up and they're all excited, and I say, put it back. And they say, put it back. And I say, yeah, you've taken it out of context. Now when we find the rest of these pieces, that one's going to be gone. So you have to put it back, and then it'll get all bagged up. And so it's not, you just can't go out and loot and vandalize. I'm not talking about that at all. And the National Park Service, and thank God for them, is taking care of our stuff. The Park Service used to let guys relic hunt in the early days. The Callan brothers would say the ranger would ride up on a horse and look at what they're finding. But there's always some bad apples, and they start digging holes and scattering beer cans all over and that kind of stuff. And you can't blame the park for that. But I actually would buy houses here in town in the late 70s simply because people wanted to split foyer and suburbia, and downtown was a ghetto. But I would buy them actually to get the artifacts out of the yard, get the cannonballs and Confederate artillery buttons and Spanish silver out of the yard. That's another thing we might talk about too, Spanish silver. That was legal American money until 1857. But anyway, Stan, thanks, and that's it. This is old stuff. Some people call it dirty old junk, but to me it's an intimacy with the past we can't get anyplace else.
Well, you heard it right from one of Fredericksburg's most celebrated historians, Mr. Jack Edlund.
Material collector.
Take care. We'll see you next time.